Greetings, my name is June. I am a bass music producer, DJ, sound designer, music educator, and this is my daughter, Persephone. Everyone say hi to Persephone. So today, I'm doing something a little different. I'm doing something just kind of fun and silly. I'm doing my first tier list. I've literally never done a tier list before. This is the very first time. And we are doing every single device included in Ableton Live 11 Suite. This includes some of the Max for Live devices. I'm also grouping some devices together because they all kind of fit under a certain genre. There's also devices I'm leaving out. For example, a lot of the CV devices I'm leaving out because I imagine not a whole lot of people are using them. I certainly never use them. I have no intention of outputting CV from my laptop. You can see here that I have every device I could find. I'm also going to be doing quick explanations of each of the devices. I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but just know if I come across a device that you haven't used before, I'll do a quick explanation of what it does. I have shuffled these around a bit. I don't want to go in any particular order. Let's just hop right in. We'll start with Reverb. It has kind of a bad reputation, and I think kind of deservedly so. As far as Reverb devices, it's pretty lackluster. A lot of the times it ends up just kind of sounding like a layer of slightly softer noise behind whatever sound you're affecting. So I'm going to put it firmly in the C tier. It's still useful. It's nice for sound design purposes if you're not really too concerned about having the highest quality reverb. You don't always need the highest quality reverb. Plus, it's very kind to your CPU as far as or how much processing power it draws. Next, Midi Envelope. So this is a modulator device that will output MIDI and use it to control parameters of other Ableton devices. Quite useful. I don't find myself using it all that often. However, I'm going to put it in the B tier because I can see a lot of uses for it, especially if you're the kind of person who likes lots of modulation sources when you're doing sound design. Next, Amp. Ooh, kind of torn between A and B on this one. Amp is a guitar amplifier emulator. It's more or less a distortion plugin. It's kind of like 6 different distortion plugins wrapped up into one. It's nice when you want distortion, but you want a bit more character to it. You want some options to switch between, as opposed to something like Overdrive, which only has a few settings and will affect the signal in pretty predictable ways. I'm gonna go with A tier. Next is the drum synths. So this is an example of devices that I have grouped together. In this we have the kick synthesizer, the clap synthesizer, the snare synthesizer, etc. Different drum sounds based off of old school analog style drum synthesizers. I've definitely used them in a pinch, although anything that you can do with the drum synthesizer, you can probably find a sample in your library that sounds like what you're looking for. I want to put them above C tier just because it's quite a nice thing to have. Yeah, I'm gonna put those in B tier. Note Echo. Okay, so this is a MIDI device. You can kind of think about it like a delay for your MIDI. It works more or less exactly like a delay would. A MIDI note comes in and gets repeated based off of parameters you set on the device. However, each time it repeats, it is at a slightly lower velocity. So, a delay, but for MIDI. I don't find myself using it all that often, although I think it's an interesting idea. I think I'm going to put it in C tier. Drum rack. This has got to be A tier. I don't think it deserves S tier just because it's not that special of a device. However, it's incredibly useful. There isn't a single track I've ever made that doesn't have a drum rack in it. There are also some features that some people might not be aware of, like there are individual sends within the drum rack, so you can put an effect in the drum rack and then have it affect all of the different cells to varying degrees, just like you would with send and return tracks. Next, compressor. So I'm not a compressor connoisseur. I'm not one of these people that obsesses about, you know, getting super high quality sound from a compressor that would rival that of a hardware compressor. But from what I understand, this compressor isn't the best. Although, to be fair, it doesn't really need to be the best. It's a compressor. It does what it does. It compresses. So for that reason, I think I'm going to put it in B tier. Shaper. This is a device I kind of talked briefly about in my last video. Granted, I talked kind of about features I wish it had. Although, it's a device that surprises me because the musical use of dynamics is something that I've kind of struggled with wrapping my head around as a composer or as a producer. So the Shaper is a nice way of taking a sound that is, you know, a C+, and then bumping it up to a B+. I'm gonna put it... I think I'm gonna put it in B tier. Spectral Resonator. Again, not a device I use all that often, although maybe I should use it more. The Spectral Resonator is, you can kind of think of it like a reverb, although it's like a reverb if the room that you're in is an oil tank or something like that. It has this kind of ringy quality to it. The idea is that you're taking the frequency spectrum and kind of just smearing it across time, and the way that often sounds has a very kind of metallic quality to it. I think I'm going to put it in C tier, only because it's not something I use all that often. Gate, kind of a utility device, not to be confused with the utility device. Something that I don't use all that often because my workflow doesn't really necessitate it, although I kind of want to bump it up because it is so useful for certain applications. If you're recording a podcast and there's room noise or something like that, it can be useful for that. Or if you're recording guitar and your pickups kind of have a bit of a hiss to them. Yeah, I think I'm going to put it in C tier, actually. There's really nothing all that special about it. Echo. Okay, this is a device that I was skeptical at first when it first got included in, I think it was introduced in Live 10. When I heard about it, I kind of rolled my eyes and I kind of thought, like, we already have 10 delay plugins. But then as I started to mess with it more, I started to understand the value of it. So this is a delay device that mimics old school analog hardware delays. And I think it does that quite well. You can add some flutter, you can add some ducking, you can add some filters to the delayed signal. And even the presets for Echo can be quite useful as just a drag and drop thing. If its sound just needs a little bit more character, it's just doop doop, and this sound has a whole new life to it. So I think it's going to go in A tier. Tension. I think this is our first F tier. I hate tension. I actually made an effort to really try and learn tension early on in my YouTube career, but this device is so finicky and so all over the place. The idea behind tension is that it mimics string instruments. So if you want to make a guitar or a sitar or a koto or something like that, tension can be a useful tool for that. Not only are the sounds not that great, but often when I would make presets for tension and I would drag them into projects later, they would be completely mangled. I assume they're just some overlooked bugs, but I've had a lot of problems with tension and getting it to cooperate. Note length is a MIDI device that will lengthen or shorten an incoming MIDI note. I've never had to use it. If I wanted to shorten a MIDI note, I'll just shorten it in the MIDI editor. Maybe there's some use for live performance context if you have like a MIDI keyboard running through Ableton. I think I'm gonna put this in D tier just because I can kind of see the use for it. I've just never had a use for it. Chord device. This is another MIDI device. The idea is that an incoming MIDI note will have other notes stacked on top of it. So if you hit a single note on your MIDI keyboard, it will output a chord. Again, narrowly useful, but not something that I've ever had a use for, although admittedly the idea has piqued my interest recently and I've been wanting to explore it, so maybe that'll be a future video or a future sample pack. I don't think it quite deserves D tier. I think it's going to be C tier. Operator, this gets S tier, no doubt in my mind. Operator is probably my favorite device in Ableton. There are definitely a few devices that rival it, however, I don't think I know any other device better than I know Operator. It's an FM synthesizer, which stands for frequency modulation synthesizer. This is easily the most powerful synth in Ableton, save for maybe one example. We'll get to that. I can't imagine using Ableton without Operator. Frequency shifter. Not a device I use for its intended purpose. I more often use the ring modulator within frequency shifter more than I use the actual frequency shifter. However, it can be nice to add a kind of chorus effect to certain sound. If you want a sound to be kind of doubled with itself, with some variation between the two versions, I think it's quite useful, so I'm going to put it in B tier. Vocoder, a device I wish I knew better. And I don't do a lot of the like typical vocoding kind of robot voice Daft Punk sounds. However, it's nice if you're doing like neuro basses and you want a device that can do some interesting filtering. That's more often what I'll use it for. I don't use it as much as I'd like to. I think I'm going to put it in B tier. Overdrive. I was kind of speaking badly about this device earlier. However, it's not horrible. Does Overdrive. I really like the included filter, so you can isolate the distorted signal to a certain frequency range, which I think is quite useful. It's also nice to modulate that, so you can get some kind of neuro wobbliness in there with just the Overdrive, so I think it gets a solid B tier. Spectrum. I'm quite handy with Spectrum. I use it quite a lot. It's nice for tuning 808s or tuning one-shot samples or something like that. Most people might be inclined to use Tuner for that. We'll get to Tuner. However, I find Spectrum a bit more friendly. Plus, it has a bunch of other uses for, you know, balancing your mix, making sure that certain frequency ranges aren't sticking out. I think it gets a solid B. Channel EQ. This is kind of a slightly more souped up version of EQ3. I don't think it's ever appeared in a single track I've made. If I need to EQ something, I'll usually use EQ8. I think it gets a C tier. I think it's fine. I could see it being useful for live performance contexts. You know, if you want some EQ capabilities with just a few knobs. Filter delay. This is a series of 3 delays running in parallel that all have separate filters on them. I've definitely used it, but I've used it just for the sake of trying something different. You know what I mean? Normally, if I need a delay, I'll just use delay, or I'll use echo, which we talked about earlier. I personally think it's just kind of one too many delay devices in Ableton. I think we could do without it, so I think it's gonna go in C tier. Spectral Time, kind of similar to the Spectral Resonator that we talked about earlier. It's kind of a time-stretching harmonic series smearer, although it doesn't have the same kind of metallic quality that Spectral Resonator does. Again, I could see it useful. I think it's going to go in C tier. Dynamic Tube. Definitely used it. Kind of like filter delay, I use it mostly when I'm sick of using the other distortion style plugins. It's almost like a mix between the cabinet device and the amp device, if that makes sense. It gives a sound a certain color, but you can't really push this device. It's quite a simple tool. So I think it's going to go in C tier. Velocity. This is the Midi Velocity device. Quite useful. I've used this quite a few times. The most common use I have for it is doing some slight randomization on elements that are meant to be like performed by a human. So oftentimes if I'm working on something that has a piano in it, I might, you know, nudge some of the MIDI notes around to get them a little bit at a time, randomize the velocity a little bit. I think it's going to go in B tier. Simpler. Use it quite a bit. The custom drum rack I use by default in my template has a bunch of simplers in it, but for no other reason other than I don't really need all the features of a sampler. It's also worth mentioning that Simpler actually has some features that Sampler doesn't. Simpler can do time stretching a whole lot better than Sampler can. There are ways of doing time stretching in Sampler, but they're kind of workarounds. Simpler, I think, gets a solid B tier. Now let's talk about the scale device. I've had students in the past who are quite handy with the scale device. In fact, I have one student in particular who is really handy with the scale device and the chord device kind of used in series. But for someone like me who has, you know, a formal music background, I know how to make things in key. So I don't find myself using it all the time, but I think it is a really useful tool for people who don't have the same background I do. So I think, oh man, I really want to put it like between B and C, but for the sake of being a little bit charitable, I'll put it in B. Delay. It's a solid delay device. Not really much to say beyond that. I think it gets a B tier. Erosion. Erosion is a kind of distortion device. To be honest, I don't quite know what's going on under the hood of the Erosion device. If I want just a little bit of dirt in a specific frequency range, it can be nice to set it to noise and then place the XY cursor where I want it, just to give it a little bit of dirt. It's not quite a distortion, it's almost like a noise adder. And the sine setting almost sounds like a bit reduction. Utility. It's a utility device, B tier. You can adjust the volume, you can adjust the panning, you can adjust the stereo width, you can flip the phase of an incoming signal. Quite useful. It's called a utility for a reason. Wavetable. Wavetable also gets an S tier. I love Wavetable. I haven't heard a lot of people singing the praises of this beautiful device. It's really no secret that it was introduced as a way of competing with Serum. Y'all ready for a hot take? I think Serum is fine. I don't get the obsession over it. I actually think Wavetable gives Serum a run for its money. Cabinet. Honestly, I think Cabinet gets an A. I think Cabinet is super useful when you just want a sound to be a little bit different. It's great for making a sound just a little bit more naturalistic. If you don't know, Cabinet is a speaker emulator, so it emulates a physical cabinet. So in the few times I've done guitar processing, I've used amp and cabinet in series, and quite nice. I think it's quite good. Tuner. D tier. I don't like Tuner. I've never found it useful. I haven't found it that accurate. The only times I have found it accurate are when I'm tuning like a sine wave sub, something that's like very steady and there's just no way that it can miss. Hybrid reverb. Ooh, I think this gets an A. Hybrid reverb is kind of an update of the reverb device. More specifically, the hybrid in hybrid reverb is the hybrid between the standard reverb in Ableton and the convolution reverb, introduced in Max for Live, I think in Ableton 9. So I really like that they took the convolution reverb and integrated it into Ableton Standard. And I think combining it with the original reverb gives it a lot of flexibility. You can get some really high quality sounds out of this. Pedal, also an A tier. I love Pedal. Again, it's a distortion unit that mimics a distortion pedal on a guitar pedal. For someone like me who does a lot of really aggressive bass sounds, it's a really great way to just spice up the character of any sound. I might compare it to amp, although I think pedal is a lot more aggressive, and it can just really give any sound a lot of life. Beat repeat. Beat repeat is an effect I got obsessed with when I first started producing, because, you know, when you would see DJs performing, more specifically like kind of mediocre DJs who don't know how to stop turning knobs, oftentimes a beat repeat effect on the tractor controller is something that they'd use a lot. And it's something that I could recognize as a listener, so it was quite exciting for me. But these days, I've used it sparingly. I'm glad it's there. I think it gets a D tier though. It's It's really not all that great. Phaser-Flanger. You know, I was going to put this in B tier, but now that I think about it a little more, I think I want to put it in A tier. So Ableton used to have two separate devices, the phaser and the flanger, and they decided to combine them into one, which I think is great. If you understand a little bit about how those devices function, they're very similar. The idea behind all these devices is that you have an incoming signal. That signal gets divided into a handful of separate signals. Each of those signals gets pitch shifted just a little bit, and then when it comes out the other end, it sounds like there are multiple iterations of that sound. Different ways of doing that are how we distinguish between choruses, phasers, and flangers, although the core idea is more or less the same. I think combining these devices together was a really good call. A tier. Midi Pitch. I find myself using this sometimes for instruments that are in drum racks, which I could just, you know, pitch shift whatever sample I'm triggering in a drum rack in the sampler device, but for whatever reason, sometimes I like to reach for the pitch device, just because it's got a bigger knob and it's easier to reach for. I think it gets a C tier though, just because it's limited in its application. EQ8. I think B tier. I think solid B tier. It's, you know, quite a good EQ. You know, it's no Pro Q. It doesn't have the limited phase or linear phase, whichever one's the good one, I forget. But I've never had a problem with it. I've never had weird phasing issues like some people complain about with stock EQs. Yeah, B tier. Analog. I feel like my relationship with analog has been a bit of an emotional roller coaster. I think when I first played around with it, I thought to myself, like, nah, it's not that useful. It doesn't even sound all that analog. You know, its features are a little limited. And then I started getting more and more into sound design. So I started using analog more. And found that I was able to create some quite nice sounds with it. And then I kind of came back around and was like, actually there's not that much to this device. I think it gets a C tier. I think it could stand as someone's first synthesizer that they play around with, because you can mess with pitch envelopes and, you know, detuning oscillators and basic modulation sources and that kind of stuff. But for someone like me who's been doing sound design for a long time, I hardly ever find myself reaching for analog. Chorus Ensemble is kind of an update of the original chorus device. I think it gets a B tier. I think with some of the updates, you're able to get some more naturalistic sounds. The ensemble in the chorus ensemble, I think, speaks to the device's ability to actually make it sound like there are multiple iterations of a sound, rather than just getting a chorus sound. Do you know what I mean? I think you know what I mean. Glue Compressor, S tier. I said earlier that I'm not really a connoisseur of compressors. However, I've found that I can consistently get a better sound with Glue Compressor than I can with the regular compressor. Glue Compressor exists to kind of emulate analog compressors, which I feel like I don't have enough experience with analog compressors to really speak to that. However, I will say that I've consistently gotten better sounds from Glue Compressor than I have from the standard compressor. The other thing worth mentioning is that Glue Compressor has soft clipping built into it, which I find myself using all the time when designing kicks and basses. Just a little bit of clipping can really spice up a sound. I also like that in Glue Compressor, there are all the parameters have notches on them. So the setting on the attack time, for example, will go from 1 millisecond and then click to 5 milliseconds. You can't do like 4 or 3 milliseconds. I like that it kind of forces you to make simpler choices in that way. I don't know. I think it's a pleasant device. I like it. Random. It's a MIDI device. It will randomize the note input. I'm sure I've used it. I can't remember how. I think it gets a D. I think when I was first starting with Ableton, I wanted to get into some like generative stuff. This was mildly useful. I think it's a fine device. However, I just hardly ever find myself reaching for it. Looper, I think it's another F tier. Why does this exist? What's frustrating about this device is that it's a device within Ableton that does what Ableton by itself already does. I used to DJ out of Ableton before I got, you know, like fancy gear and whatnot. And when I would DJ, I would also incorporate things like percussion loops. And I even experimented with, it's almost embarrassing to say, I experimented with beatboxing on top of the track and looping that. But I didn't use the looper device. I just used the looping feature in Ableton Session View. I don't think this needs to exist. I think you could delete it and very few people would care. Electric. Oh, God. I think it gets another F tier. This is a tough one. I'm torn between F tier and D tier because I have used some electric presets. However, when I would use them, they were often very peripheral elements to my track. I think it gets a D tier only because there isn't really another way to get the electric piano sound in Ableton. That being said, it's a very finicky device and it's very limited. I think D is fair. Impulse, I think gets a D tier. It's basically declawed drum rack. I don't know if there's much more to say. It exists only so that the users of Ableton Live Lite will have some sort of drum sequencing device. That being said, there is a feature in Impulse that isn't included in drum rack, and that's the ability to stretch the sample. So take that for what you will. Collision. People who have checked out my channel before might know that I believe that this is the most underrated synth in Ableton. It's a physical modeling synthesizer. It emulates things like beams or strings or, vibrating membranes and stuff like that. You can synthesize, synth leads. You can synthesize guitars. You can synthesize, drums. It's a very, very useful device. I think the only reason it doesn't get S tier is because it's kind of finicky. It doesn't always work the way you want it to. Sometimes there are artifacts in the sound. It also doesn't have like a comprehensive glide feature just because of the nature of how the instrument works. If you want to know more about Collision, check out my video on Collision. I think it's severely underrated. However, I also understand why other people don't love it as much as I do. Drum Bus. I think it's an A. I think this was a nice addition to Ableton Live 10, I believe, is when it was introduced. It's kind of a combination of distortion and compression and also boom adder. If you have a drum kit and you just need things to fit together a little bit nicer so they sound like one instrument rather than a bunch of disparate elements, it gets an A tier from me. Corpus. Also, I think a very underutilized device. Corpus is basically Collision without the oscillator. It's Collision if Collision was an audio effect. It's like if a Reverb had a baby with a flanger. I talked earlier about Spectral Resonator kind of having this metallic quality to it. Corpus has a metallic quality, but it's by design. If you want your sound to sound like it's in a big oil drum, or if you want your sound to sound like there are some nearby sympathetic resonating strings, super useful. I think it gets B tier. EQ3, D tier. I don't know. I think I'd put it in C tier if channel EQ didn't exist. Again, channel EQ is just kind of a slightly more souped up EQ3. I used to use EQ3 when I would perform with Ableton because it mimics, a 3-channel EQ like you'd have on a DJ mixer. It's useful for that reason. Again, I think the only reason it exists now is so that users of Ableton Live Lite will have an EQ. Auto filter. I think it gets A tier. Yeah, I love auto filter. It's a filter device, high pass, low pass, band pass, and also morph filter, which was a nice addition. There are also some distortion features in auto filter, as well as some auto wah kind of features where the dynamics of the incoming signal will affect the frequency cutoff of the filter. Very useful sound design tool. Vinyl distortion. This is a frustrating device because it doesn't really do what it says on the tin. I think it gets D tier, although I think I'm only putting it there out of spite. So if you've messed around with vinyl distortion, you may know the crackle knob. You turn up the knob and it adds these little crackle artifacts that sound horrible and fake. By no means do they actually mimic the sound of a vinyl record or anything like that. That being said, the distortion elements in vinyl distortion, I think, can be narrowly useful. You can kind of get that like old crappy speaker sound if that's what you need. Auto pan. I think auto pan gets C tier. I use AutoPan a lot, but not actually for the panning feature. So the way AutoPan works is that it basically uses two separate LFOs to change the volume of your left and right channel on that track. However, if you set the phase knob to 0, then both of those LFOs will be in sync, and so you can use it as a tremolo device. That's often how I use AutoPan, is I just set the phase to 0, and then I have this way of just making the volume go up and down really quickly, which is an effect I like. The Midi LFO, I think it's a B tier, along with the Midi Envelope. It's more or less the same thing as the Midi Envelope, except it's an LFO. You map the device to a parameter on a separate Ableton device, and it will modulate that parameter using an LFO. Very, very useful. Limiter is trash. It gets a D tier. Again, I'm not a person who fixates on the quality of my compressors or my EQs or stuff like that. However, I think it's pretty well established that the Ableton limiter is not great. I'd really like to see an update of it. And when I say an update, I hope Ableton developers are listening. Please listen right now. I don't want a separate limiter device that is better. I want the limiter device, by default, to be better. Dennis, I know you're listening. Whatever. Grain delay. A tier. I love grain delay. When I was first getting into electronic music, I got really, really into the, like, glitch sound. Specifically artists like Resonant Language, Tipper, Mr. Bill, and they would often have these kind of squelchy, bubbly, very granular kind of sounds. And obviously those artists use devices that are a lot more sophisticated than the ones I do. However, I think grain delay does a good job of at least approaching those sounds. You know, it's not quite as powerful as like the Glitch Machine series of effects. However, for what it is, I think it's quite good. And if you get really good at using it, then you can get some really powerful sounds out of it. Redux is fine. It gets a C tier. It's a bit reduction thing. It has a big knob on it. You turn it and it changes the bit depth. That's fine. It needs to exist. C tier. Multiband Dynamics. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention OTT with Multiband Dynamics, which is one of the presets of the device, which I use more than I do just a blank Multiband Dynamics device. I've heard from some people I know who are mastering engineers that Multiband Dynamics can be really useful for controlling the dynamics of just a very particular band of frequencies. However, I'm not a ninja with it, so I just throw OTT on stuff and make it sound very, very way more louder. Envelope follower. I haven't used this device in years. C tier. No, D tier. I don't know. I could see it being useful if you're in a very particular situation, but even now that I say that, I'm having trouble imagining what that situation is. You might be able to use it for, like, side chaining, although I don't know if you'd get a really good sound from that. I don't have that much to say about it. Sampler. A tier. Sampler rocks. It's got a bunch of features. It's like simpler, but better. What do you want from me? It's great. One feature I really like in Sampler is the oscillator that can FM the sample. That's quite cool. I also really like using the envelope to change the start point of the sample, or even randomize the start point of the sample. Unlike Simpler, which I think kind of only exists to just playback samples, Sampler is a sound design tool. You can mangle these sounds with Sampler. In fact, no. You know what? S tier. Even me just talking about it, I realized how cool Sampler is, so it gets a bump up. Arpeggiator. It's an arpeggiator. C tier. When I was first starting out, I refused to use the arpeggiator for some reason. I think it was because it felt like cheating. I felt like I needed to input all the notes by hand. But now that I'm older and wiser, I realize there's no such thing as cheating in music. You know, music's not a competition. There's no winner or loser. You have the tools available to you to do what you can. That being said, it's quite a limited arpeggiator. when I do use the arpeggiator, I'm not often making like motivated choices. I will usually have a chord on my MIDI track, I'll throw in an arpeggiator, and then I'll just turn knobs until I hear something I like. I don't like to approach music that way. I like to be very intentional about everything I do. But that being said, I use arpeggiator all the time. Resonators. 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 Resonators is kind of a series of specialized tuned delays where the delay time is so tight that it actually creates a pitch, but it's a handful of those delays in parallel. So, say for example you have a snare drum that thwacks, and I have the resonators set to a major chord. The resonator will create a ringing sound that trails off of that drum sound that is a major chord. I've used it quite a bit in sound design. However, as a device, it's only narrowly useful. I actually think that I use resonator more than most Ableton users would. But that being said, it's still a pretty limited device, so I think it gets a C tier. Rotating rhythm generator. I hate this device. I hate devices that exist only to mimic the workflow of old school analog hardware. Like I kind of explained with Looper, the things you can do with rotating rhythm generator, you can just do in a MIDI sequencer. You can just do them in the session view of Ableton. I think if you're like an old head who has lots and lots of experience with old school hardware and stuff like that, maybe I could see why this would appeal to you. But if, you know, you're on the younger side and you know how to sequence MIDI, I don't think there's ever really a need for you to use this device. And last but not least, Saturator, which I hope you all know is going straight to S tier. Easily the most versatile distortion device in Ableton. You got things like soft clipping, you got all sorts of different kinds of wave shaping going on, you have a kind of more analog style, and then you have more aggressive digital styles, and then you have sine-based distortions. You can also change how the distortion affects different frequency ranges. Oh my god, I could go on forever about Saturator. It's great. And very CPU friendly. I would honestly say that if you really know the Saturator device, you can get near identical sounds that you can with Isotope Trash. And Isotope Trash is a pretty hefty product. I think the integration with Ableton sets this device above almost any VST that you can buy. And I know this is kind of a recurring theme on this channel, where I just go on and on about how you don't need external VSTs, especially the ones that you have to pay a lot of money for. All that is to say, Saturator's great, and yeah, I don't know what I'd do without Saturator. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. If you want to support the channel, you can visit my Patreon. My Patreon, I release monthly sample packs. So far, I've released almost 500 individual samples at this point, and you can get all those for just $1. So what are you waiting for? Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope to see you all soon.